Okay, so in this short lecture, we are going to talk about policy implementation. We're going to talk about what that means, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about the role of ambiguity and the role that that plays in implementation. And then in the class on Wednesday, we are going to do another lecture on street level bureaucrats. These are the people who are responsible for implementing policies on the ground. And we're going to do an activity kind of surrounding the work that they do too. So let's get started. Okay, so I think first and foremost, the most important part of maybe this lecture or an important consideration are that policies are ultimately implemented by people, right? So it's people who are the people on the ground or even frontline managers who are interpreting and then ultimately implementing policy. These are people like wilderness rangers, like game wardens, or even if we want to think about it in a different way, research scientists who are kind of knowledge producers and they're working within the policies that have been written in their grants, and they're using their discretion in order to learn about the natural world or learn about whatever their topic is, right? But policies are implemented by people. This is a really, really important point. It's an important consideration, and it opens up a whole host of different things, like how policies are implemented by people who might have different attitudes from one another. They might have different values, different beliefs from one another. So the way that these policies are often implemented might look different on the ground. And we'll talk about what that means, what that looks like, in a little bit, and I think we're going to talk much more explicitly about it in our lecture on Wednesday on street level bureaucrats, but also in our activity too. We're kind of going to get a sense for what that actually looks like. Okay, so there are different parts of the implementation system. So these are like different levels or scales of implementation. And I'll let you pause if you want to look at the policy field and the organizational levels. But we're going to focus on the front lines in this class for the most part, right? So when you're doing social science at this level, the focus of analysis are really the workers or the people who interface or directly interact with a target population that carries out a particular program. This could be teachers carrying out education policies. These could be wilderness rangers carrying out wilderness policies. They could be, people on the ground working fire, right? There are different types of workers who are working with the target population, which could be nature, it could be something that's not people necessarily, carrying out a particular program. The role of these frontline workers are to enact the program or to facilitate the target group. Again, this could be nature, this could be people with the program itself. And then ultimately the work that's accomplished at this level, or that resources and services are delivered, and then also people do these assessments of quality. But really, like this whole idea of services being delivered and resources being delivered, you can again think about teachers. The resource or service that they're providing is education. Nurses provide healthcare. Wilderness rangers provide wilderness stewardship. Firefighters provide, they fight fires and they provide, a safe place, or they protect homes, they protect biophysical resources, a variety of things, right? So, at virtually any agency, there's going to be people on the ground who are, delivering services, implementing policy, doing that kind of work. So we have like an activity, I suppose. I'm going to ask you to pause and think about this, but I want you to think about environmental policies and how we can better use social scientists to understand the need for a policy, the implementation of a policy, and then the effect of a policy. Also kind of discuss internally how the biophysical sciences could be used in this. We're not going to really talk about that in this lecture. So I just invite you to press pause now and think about that. Okay, so when we're thinking about social science, I'm just going to kind of go through what I think how social science could be used and how it has been used in the past and today for these different kind of stages of the policy process, right? So the need for policy, right? We could do surveys or interviews of people about a particular natural resource issue. to get a sense as to whether or not something needs to be created or changed in terms of a policy that would better serve the needs of people or of nature or the environment, what have you, right? So we can do a variety of different kinds of social science research to really understand the need for policies. We can also understand implementation of a policy in various ways using social science. First we could use social science to, understand how the policy is being delivered, right? We could do interviews of on-the-ground workers who are implementing policies and ask them questions about, what that policy implementation looks like. We might ask them stories, or we might ask them to tell us stories as researchers about times they maybe broke the rules a little bit in terms of implementing policy and looking at the reasons why they did. That can kind of shed light on some of their beliefs or values. We could also interview people, and we could talk to the public about their perceptions of how policies have been implemented. This could be by using surveys, this could be focus groups, this could be interviews, a variety of different kind of methods we could use to understand how the public perceives the implementation of policies. Next, we could also study the effect of a policy, right? So, we could do social science again, do surveys, do interviews, asking workers or asking the public, what they perceive the effect of policies are. All of these things are useful, right? Like by assessing the need for a policy using social science, we can create policies that are informed by science. By assessing the implementation of a policy with social science, we can improve the implementation of policy in certain ways, perhaps informed by science. And then by understanding the effects of policies, we can really determine the efficacy or the effect of policies on different communities. And these communities could be, overall large level populations. We could look at the disparate effects that the same policy might have on different communities, including in marginalized communities. But also we could use the biophysical sciences to think about how policies achieve or don't achieve their goals, or what unintended consequences kind of arise as a result of the implementation of a policy. Okay, so really importantly, here's an example. I wanted to talk about how policies are ambiguous. That was a little bit of a quick transition there. But policies are ambiguous. They're ambiguously written, and policies come from laws, and this is a law called the Wilderness Act of 1964. And we'll just kind of look at the bolded text, right? So a lot of these words in this particular law are very ambiguous, right? So what is natural? What's a natural condition? There's different ideas about what naturalness here is. Generally appears to be affected primarily by the forces of nature, right? So what does appear mean? What does primarily mean? What is, the imprint of man's work substantially? What does substantially mean? What does solitude mean? What does primitive mean? What does unconfined mean, right? I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but you can see in the law itself, this Wilderness Act of 1964, which we're going to talk about later in the semester, the law is really ambiguous. And from there, they develop policies that also kind of mirror the ambiguity of those laws, right? So, for instance, for solitude, right, there could be policies at the forest level, like at a Forest Service unit, that says that, let's say, sound levels need to be an acceptable level from artificial noise. Like, what does acceptable mean, right? These are a lot of subjectivity it plays into this. Best available science is also a relatively ambiguous policy that comes from, or that you see in a variety of different laws and policies too. So when we ask about like what best available science is, like there's some guidance there in terms of what it is, but there's ambiguity in it too, right? So these are just some examples: the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and this USDA planning rule, which is a policy. All of these mention that the best available science should inform decision making when folks are taking into consideration these laws and policies and the work that they're doing. Again, there's some guidance on what best available science is, anywhere from like published research to grade literature to professional knowledge, but it doesn't specifically say like when to use which. There's a lot of, again, ambiguity and vagueness there. For this is the best available science, the language from the USDA planning rule. So it says stuff like, in some circumstances, the best available scientific information would be that which is developed using scientific method, blah, blah, blah. However, in other circumstances, it could be this. Other circumstances, it could be that. And then lastly, it says, as long as the responsible official has a reasonable basis for relying on that scientific information as the best available, right? So again, there's lots and lots of ambiguity here. I didn't want to read through the whole thing. I do encourage you to pause and read through it. But the point here is that in this USDA planning rule, it talks about it talks about the different circumstances in which you use certain circumstances in which the best available science is one thing, other circumstances in which it's another. But ultimately, it's about the perception of the people using that science to kind of apply this planning rule. So again, it's an ambiguous policy. Another ambiguous policy is from Golden Gate National Recreation Area. They have a pet policy from 1979, and it defines these things as unmanaged dogs and cats, and it provides definitions for what an unmanaged dog and cat would look like. This is maybe this is clear. Dogs that are not supervised from owners, cats and dogs that have escaped domestication and become wild. Those are a little bit clearer, I guess. But then managed dogs, these are ones that are under control of their owner at all times. Okay, that's not super clear. It doesn't say anything about like a leash or anything like that, and one person's perception of their dog being under control might be different from another. Again, it says this control may be by voice or leash, right? Like the voice is kind of the more ambiguous term here. Like, what does voice control look like? And then it says the criterion is that the dog may not harass any person or animal. Harass is a psychological state that the person kind of receiving a dog's behavior would experience. So it's like, how do we assess that? Like that's a pretty ambiguous term, right? The voice or leash control, to kind of deal with the ambiguity, they say it's a flexible system, and then it doesn't really say much afterwards in terms of what that looks like. It says the success of such a system is dependent on the willingness of visitors and residents to cooperate with personnel, the willingness of personnel to manage dogs, people in wildlife situations, to enforce regulations, and to cite violators. So all we're trying to get at here is that there's a lot of ambiguity in this pet policy that people who work at Golden Gate National Recreation Area have to deal with, and also visitors have to deal with this ambiguous policy too. Here's a residential yard ordinance from Mound, Minnesota. This is just about yards and what they should look like. And again, let's just kind of look at the bolded text, right? So landscape should be landscaped attractively, and that any areas left in a natural state should be properly maintained in a sightly and well-kept condition. Like, what does attractive mean? What does properly maintained mean? What does sightly mean? And what does well-kept mean? Like, different people are going to have different perceptions about what those different terms mean. Okay, so again, let's do an activity in which we pause, right? So by yourself, I just want you to develop two lists. The first is, why is policy ambiguity a good thing? The second is, why is it a bad thing? So you can press pause now. Okay, so just thinking out loud here, policy ambiguity is good in some ways, right? Like some people think that policies can be implemented more fairly when they're ambiguous, because the person on the ground is going to have expertise in that local context, and they would implement a policy in a way that they feel is fair, that they feel fits the situation, right? The idea is, by treating everybody exactly the same, maybe that kind of takes away some context and some of the fairness right away from it. So bad thing about policy being ambiguous, Right, kind of related to that, when people who implement policies are using their biases coming from their attitudes, their beliefs, their values, the norms that they experience about what's good and bad. Policy ambiguity could look really unfair in certain situations. And someone who's a law enforcement officer at a national park might throw the book at somebody who they think doesn't look or act like a quote unquote good person, or like with good moral character. This is what the literature says. And people's biases can play into those judgments. People's racist biases can play into those judgments too. And we see that different groups of people, marginalized people, often are going to feel the power of the state more severely in a lot of circumstances than dominant cultural groups. So we can kind of see the drawbacks of ambiguous policies, and obviously that situations like that aren't entirely driven by policy ambiguity, but certainly ambiguity kind of does play a role in some of those situations. Okay, so with that said, these the good and bad kind of like what's is ambiguity good or bad? People who are top-down theorists think that ambiguity is bad. These are folks who think that all policies should be written pretty much exactly the same, and by writing things exactly the same in a really, really clear manner, that leads to fairness. But bottom-up theorists think that ambiguity is good and it's inevitable. And again, we can use our kind of local expertise, our local knowledge about people, about the community, about the natural community, to influence what policy implementation looks like. Okay, so in class on Wednesday, we are going to do a lecture on street-level bureaucracy and frontline worker research and scholarship, and we are also going to be doing some activities. I think the main thing that I want you all to come away with on Wednesday, and maybe this entire week, like the main point, is that I want us to shift our thinking away from thinking about policies as just these abstract written things that exist out there that don't affect our lives. And I want us to really understand that policies are important, that policies are implemented by people, and different people might implement different policies differently. And there are big questions of ethics and fairness when that happens. So I'm really excited for Wednesday. I think it's going to be a really interesting, fun class. And so have a good week. And let us know if you have any questions. Thanks.